We are delighted to welcome today's our guest to European University Institute in Florence, Professor Sarah Birch. She is Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Glasgow, and she published many works on democratization and corruption in post-communist countries, and recently she's been working on electoral malpractice in developing countries. And today's her Max Weber lecture will be also on the dynamics of electoral manipulation in electoral authoritarian regimes. And thank you so much, Sarah, for this great opportunity to speak with you today. So, Steffi?
I'm going to start with the first question. As Masaaki already mentioned, one of your main research interests is electoral integrity, and recently you've been working on a model that you're calling the Electoral Tango model in order to explain the dynamics of electoral malpractice in electoral authoritarian regimes. Could you explain us a little bit about the model?
Well, the basic principle behind this model is very simple, that elections have to get bad before they get better. So one step back then leads to 2 steps forward. So a lot of the work that a number of scholars have been doing on electoral malpractice has been focused on looking at what causes electoral malpractice. And all the work I do has looked at the causes, but there hasn't been so much work on what causes levels of electoral quality to change over time. But there has been some recent work that's come out that's looked at the role of post-electoral protest and popular mobilisation against electoral malpractice. And I've been building in my own work on some of this research and developed this model that purports to show, attempts to show that elections tend to improve when people demand improvements to election quality, and this usually involves a mobilisation around movements, causes that are related to the reduction of electoral fraud and the improvement of electoral institutions. And it's under these circumstances, when people mobilise to demand a change to electoral institutions, that in some cases at least, leaders then do institute reforms. And so what I look at in my model is under what circumstances these leaders are prepared to introduce reforms and that lead to improvement in the quality of the elections.
So what policy implications may the Electoral Tango model have for international election monitoring and its effort to democratization in electoral authoritarian regimes?
I don't think that the model really has any implications for election monitoring, because monitors, they go in, they document and they leave, and this provides information on the quality of elections. But I think it does potentially have some implications for electoral assistance, in as much as people who provide electoral assistance very often provide it in a context where it's not very effective because the circumstances aren't right for that assistance to work. I mean, either the authoritarian regime is too entrenched and has no intention of reforming the electoral system, so it might make some cosmetic reforms to say, yes, well, you asked us to change this aspect of the electoral law, so we did, so now our elections are better, but they haven't actually made a reform. So I think this model helps to identify the circumstances under which electoral assistance will be most useful and helpful, and will hopefully enable the people who give electoral assistance to select the countries and circumstances under which they provide assistance to countries more in a more targeted manner, so that they're not wasting so much money on assistance that doesn't work.
So as you've just illustrated, the insights we gained from your research are really important not only for academics but also for practitioners like international organizations, civil society, electoral monitoring bodies, and so on. Are you ever concerned that political elites that aim to commit electoral fraud might also use your insights for their benefits in order to find out how to better go about it?
Not in connection with the work I've done so far on electoral fraud and electoral malpractice per se, because most of the factors that I've identified that are related to electoral malpractice are not things that leaders necessarily would be able to change or would want to change in the short term, such as things like inequality or propensity for people to mobilise on the ground and things like that. However, I'm doing some other work where that has become a very important issue for me recently. I'm doing the research project I've just begun recently is on electoral violence, and we're doing some forecasting. So we're actually developing a model and predicting which elections are going to be violent in, say, 2016, 2017, and which types of violence are going to occur. Is it going to be violence by the state or violence by non-state actors and so forth? And that is a real issue. We can't just publish these predictions because, you know, if, for example, the state discovered that our prediction was that the non-state actors were going to commit violence in a particular type of election, they might then undertake preemptive violence, and so our research findings would be causing violence. And so that is an issue in that circumstance, and we have chosen, therefore, to only share our predictions with certain groups who we can be confident won't distribute those, and not to publish them more widely. But that has been, you know, a choice we've had to think about very carefully.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that there will be a point in time when you will be able to publish the model that these predictions are based on to the wider public, or do you think that this will always present a problem?
We will definitely publish the model, but what we'll do is we'll develop a model that goes up to, say, 2012, and then do out-of-sample predictions for 2013, 2014, 2015. So although we're simulating a prediction, we're not actually predicting into the future in the stuff we publish. And it shouldn't really change. The accuracy of the model. In fact, it makes it easier to see how good our model is, because we're comparing against things that have already happened. So we have other sources of information which will enable us to determine whether, you know, the extent to which our model was predicting accurately. And that's what other academics would want to know. They probably aren't so interested in our predictions of 2016. They're interested in how good our model is. So it's a different community that would be interested in the actual predictions.
Okay. So you began your career by studying democratization and elections in Ukraine. And in your second book, you extended your scope to other post-communist countries. And for a series of electoral malpractice projects, you are now using a cross-national data set that covers, you know, almost all the country around the globe. So, so could you tell us a little bit about what encouraged you to extend your scope to other developing countries, and also the pros and cons that you see in studying, you know, politics cross-nationally versus in more, you know, nationally specific contexts?
Well, I started studying Ukraine and Eastern Europe because I had theoretical interest in the processes that were going on there. I became interested in Eastern Europe in 1991. I spent a couple of years in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany, and then Ukraine. And I was never really that interested in those countries as cultures or because of any specific aspect of the country per se. I was interested because of the political processes that were going there. So I was interested in the countries for abstract theoretical reasons. But once you've studied a country for a while, you want to test some of the ideas you've developed on a broader context to see if those ideas hold up in other countries as well. And so you have a natural tendency to want to look outside your country to other similar countries, and then ultimately to other parts of the world. And so I've done that. However, that said, my publications, as you've noted, suggest that I've moved completely away from Eastern Europe, and I just do have global data sets, which I usually do. But actually there's more back and forth in my intellectual development than is evident from my publication record, in the sense that I do very often go back to the countries that I have more intimate knowledge of, such as Ukraine, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Bosnia, other countries that I know quite well, Serbia, and test some of the ideas I'm developing on you know, the ground truth of what's in my head about what I know about those countries. And so and I sometimes draw on case studies from those countries that I'm most familiar with. So there is actually a lot of back and forth, and I think that's useful for researchers. I think researchers who only start with large N data sets and don't really know any countries well, they sometimes develop theories that are not necessarily that plausible, and I think it helps to be familiar with the real workings, internal workings of, you know, a few countries, and know how politics operates, you know, in those contexts to be able to develop theories. And so I think that both large N analysis is useful, and having knowledge of specific countries also helps to it's a sort of a garden for ideas. It helps you to develop your ideas. Then you go and test a large data set, and that's still what I do.
how did you derive your electoral tango model? So did you have some specific countries in mind when you construct your current theory of electoral tango model?
Well, I think it's often said of a number of people who develop broad theories that they always have a country in mind. I think I always say this about Steinrück, and he was going back to Norway, and I became interested in electoral malpractice through my work in Ukraine and also Bosnia. But then after I'd been working on electoral malpractice for a few years, and the Orange Revolution happened in Ukraine, and that has really shaped a lot of my thinking. And I think you can see the Ukrainian experience in the electoral tango model of elections. There were a big crisis of the quality of elections, and that enabled a lot of people to mobilise to demand better quality elections, and then the elections improved. And also the Serbian model is also there. So I think certainly the idea for the electoral tango model does come from my knowledge of Eastern Europe, although I wasn't happy to just advance it on the basis of those cases I knew. I thought it was necessary to test it on a wider, broader data set to see if it applied also in other parts of the world.
You've mentioned some countries that you've been particularly interested in, and they're all in Central and Eastern Europe. They're all fairly new democracies or countries that are still in transition to democracy or haven't transitioned to democracy yet. And that's probably the sorts of countries where we'd expect issues like electoral fraud to play a role. But you've actually also focused on more established democracies such as Britain and France, and you've published a book called Ethics and Integrity in British Politics. So what role does the issue of electoral fraud or the topic of electoral integrity play in these countries? Are there any particular ways in which electoral integrity might be compromised, and might that potentially negatively affect the legitimacy of democracy in these countries, or are the issues of a different kind?
I think they're the same issues, but people have only recently realised that. There were two things that started to make scholars look at electoral integrity in established democracies, two things that happened more or less at the same time. And that was firstly, people like me started to do electoral systems in other parts of the world, starting in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And then the election in 2000 in the United States, presidential election, it was much disputed with hanging chads in Florida and so forth. That made a lot of scholars really interested in electoral integrity. And given that these two things happened more or less at the same time, there were a lot of scholars around the world who started to look at popular confidence in elections, so popular electoral conduct, popular perceptions of electoral conduct, and also at actual electoral conduct. And this has developed as a subfield within the study of established politics as well. And I think there are two really interesting things that have come out of this. Firstly, a lot of people have much less confidence in electoral processes than we had thought. I mean, for a long time, surveys didn't even ask questions about electoral conduct, and asked questions about the legitimacy of parliaments or legislatures, the legitimacy of courts, and trust in this institution or that institution. But they didn't even bother to ask about trust in electoral conduct because it was assumed that there wasn't an issue. And then people all of a sudden looked at some of the data that was available and thought, oh, hang on, actually a lot of people don't have confidence in the conduct of elections, even though elites mostly do. And then, at the same time, a lot of people began to realise that there were problems with the conduct of elections in established democracies that were greater, actual objective problems that were greater than people had thought. Not so much fraud committed by voters, which I think is exaggerated in many contexts, but simply elections aren't run as well as they are in a lot of newer democracies because they're sort of outdated, archaic electoral administration systems that are left over from an earlier era. So many of the newer democracies have sort of up-to-date, state-of-the-art electoral administration, and some of the older democracies have actually pretty poor electoral practices. And so there's been an effort in recent years to re-examine some of the electoral practices of some of the older democracies and to try to improve them, and hopefully then to improve confidence in electoral conduct. But one of the things that people have discovered is that once voters lose confidence in the way elections are conducted, it takes a long time to regain their trust. And there have been recent crises in the United States following the 2000 elections, also in the United Kingdom and in Australia more recently. And once confidence declines, it declines. It stays low for quite a number of years. And so this is why it's important for electoral administrators to really think very carefully about what they're doing, even if they think that their elections are okay, because ordinary people may not think they're okay, and that itself can be an issue. It can be an issue for electoral participation, as I've shown in some of my work, and it can be an issue for trust in politicians more generally, and trust in the state, compliance with the law and other things.
And has anything been done about this, for instance, in the UK?
Well, there's a lot being done in the UK, in the US, and other democracies also, to revisit electoral standards, to try to monitor more regularly the way elections are conducted, especially in sort of decentralized systems, and to try to think again about, changing things, improving things, bringing some of these countries' standards up to the standards of newer democracies, for example, allowing electoral observers, doing regular surveys of people who run elections and also voters to identify areas where there are problems and so forth. And so a lot of elections around the world are improving, not just in newer democracies, but also in established democracies. Although there have been some contexts where this has become very, very politicized, which then creates other problems, such as I'm thinking of the United States in particular.
Previously, you published a work on electoral system type and electoral malpractice based on the data from post-communist countries. And do you think that there is also, strong relationship between electoral system and electoral fraud or electoral manipulation in developed countries?
I'm beginning to have second thoughts about that argument, because I think to a large extent, particularly in developing countries, institutions are endogenous.
Right.
Leaders may select institutions because they think that they will help them to achieve a certain end, or not change institutions they've inherited because they think that that will help them to pursue their ends. And so I'm not entirely convinced anymore that that electoral institutions are as exogenous as people think they are. However, it certainly seems that in the very decentralized electoral administration systems, which I don't think is, I don't think decentralization of electoral administration, I think, is something that's generally inherited. Countries don't introduce decentralized electoral administration, so I don't think that that's endogenous. But decentralization, I think, is associated with a lot of problems. So not necessarily whether a country is first past the post or proportional representation, but other aspects of the electoral system that political scientists have, until recently, not looked at so much, like the extent of centralization, the extent to which there's oversight by oversight bodies, or there are separate institutions that can adjudicate on issues of electoral malpractice. How easy is it to bring a complaint, for example, and how are those complaints dealt with? How costly is it to bring a complaint? Some of those aspects of the electoral system, I think, are very relevant even in established democracies. And those are things that political scientists haven't really looked at so much. So in political scientists, they talk about electoral systems. Their focus is almost exclusively on the vote-to-seat conversion formula, which is only one minute aspect of the electoral process. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done on other aspects of electoral institutions, in addition to the vote-to-seat conversion formula, and on how those affect electoral conduct.
Thank you
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.